The vibration against the metal prep table was a violent intrusion at 1:17 a.m. The kitchen was finally still. The exhaust fans hummed a low, dying note, and the lights were harsh against the scrubbed metal. I looked down. The screen lit up the gloom. Sadie Ortega. The name alone was a shot of adrenaline. "What happens when the tasting menu ends?" she asked. My heart slammed against my ribs, loud enough to echo in the emptiness. She was still out there, waiting. I wiped my hands on my apron, the fabric rough against my damp palms, and walked toward the swinging doors. 3 hours earlier, the silence was unimaginable. The kitchen was a living thing, breathing heat and shouting orders. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of searing scallops, reducing veal stock, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. "Order in, 2 tasting, table 4, the sous chef barked, his voice cutting through the hiss of the pans. "Oui, chef," the brigade responded in unison, a rhythmic chant that kept the chaos at bay. I stood at the pass, the conductor of this sweating, frantic symphony, checking every plate for flaws that only I, or a woman like Sadie Ortega, would notice. The stakes were etched into every surface of this building. This restaurant was the last remnant of Julian's legacy, a temple to gastronomy that he'd left me, along with a mountain of debt. The bank had called 3 times this week. The suppliers were getting restless. Every night felt like a high-wire act, where the net was fraying a little more. We needed a miracle. We needed the kind of review that made phones ring off the hook. Instead, we got the executioner. I saw her silhouette first, framed by the narrow window of the kitchen doors. Sadie Ortega didn't walk. She glided, her posture terrifyingly perfect against the soft amber lighting of the dining room. She sat at table 4, the lone diner in a sea of couples, unwrapping her napkin with the precision of a surgeon preparing to operate. A hush fell over the front of house. My servers moved stiffer, their smiles tighter. They knew. Everyone knew. Sadie didn't just review restaurants, she dissected them. She looked for the soul of a place, and if she found it wanting, she crushed it without mercy. I looked down at the ticket, and the blood rushed in my ears. Venison. The pivot point of the entire menu. It was a risk, a deconstructed tartare that balanced on the edge of tradition and arrogance. I pulled the station closer. My hands were steady. Muscle memory is a powerful shield. But my mind flashed back to Paris. I could almost smell the burnt butter, feel the humiliation of that night 5 years ago when I tried to be too clever and lost everything. I couldn't let the past bleed into this plate. Not tonight. Not with her watching from the shadows. I focused on the ingredients. The venison was ruby red, cold and firm under my fingers as I arranged the hand-cut cubes. I worked with obsession, placing the pickled chanterelles just so, adding the dots of juniper emulsion with a trembling intensity I forced into stillness. The rye crisp had to be shattered just right, imperfectly perfect. The kitchen faded around me. The clatter of the dishwasher, the shout of the grill station, the heat, it all blurred into white noise. The world narrowed down to the circumference of this ceramic canvas. I placed the final garnish, a sprig of wood sorrel that added a necessary bite of acid. I wiped the rim of the plate, my eyes scanning for a fingerprint, a smudge, a single error that would give her the opening she didn't need. "Service," I called out, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. The runner took the plate. I watched it go, feeling a piece of my own chest leave with it. The kitchen held its collective breath. We weren't just serving dinner. We were offering a tribute to a god who might not be listening. The swinging doors swallowed the runner, and I leaned against the stainless steel, waiting for the verdict that could save us or bury us. I became a ghost at the pass, invisible to the line cooks who were already pivoting to the next order, but hyper-aware of the singular drama unfolding at table 4. The kitchen pass is a strange purgatory, a narrow, stainless steel border between the inferno of creation and the hushed theater of consumption. From here, I could see the dining room in a series of fragmented vignettes, framed by the shelf of heat lamps. Most guests were blurs of conversation and clinking glass, but Sadie was a study in stillness. The ambient noise of the service, the clatter of pans, the shout of hot behind, the rhythmic thud of knives, began to recede, dampened by the intensity of my focus. I wasn't breathing. I was observing. She didn't eat like a customer. She ate to understand. I watched her pick up her fork, the silver glinting in the low light. She didn't dive in. She paused, hovering over the plate, likely assessing the architecture I had just agonized over. It was terrifying, like watching someone read your diary while you stood helplessly in the corner. She used her knife to separate a single cube of venison, ensuring it carried a precise ratio of components. The movement was surgical, devoid of hesitation. She lifted the fork. I gripped the pass until my knuckles turned white. She took the bite. There was no immediate smile, no theatrical nod of approval that lesser critics might offer to their dining companions. She chewed slowly, her eyes unfocused, looking inward. She was deconstructing the flavor profile, cataloging the acidity, the texture, the temperature contrast between the cool meat and the warm rye crisp. I tried to read her face, searching for a micro-expression of disgust or delight, but she gave me nothing. Her expression was a mask of professional detachment, a wall built of glass and expectation that I couldn't climb. Then the air shifted. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a sudden change in pressure. Sadie stopped chewing. She swallowed, set her fork down with deliberate care, and looked up. Her gaze didn't wander. It cut straight through the fluctuating shadows of the dining room, past the servers, through the narrow serving window, and locked directly onto mine. The distance between us, 30 feet of floorboards and social hierarchy, collapsed instantly. The kitchen behind me vanished. The sous chef shouting faded into a dull hum. There was only the weight of her eyes, dark and unflinching, holding me in place. It wasn't a glare, and it wasn't a smile. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. "I see what you did here," that look said. "I taste the risk you took." My skin prickled under the chef's whites, a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the ovens. For 5 seconds, we were the only two people in the building, connected by the invisible thread of that venison tartare. Then, just as quickly, she looked away, picking up her wineglass to cleanse her palate, breaking the circuit. The plate came back 10 minutes later. I intercepted it before the dishwasher could spray it down. It was empty. Not just finished, but decimated. There wasn't a stray herb or a smear of emulsion left on the ceramic. In the language of kitchens, a clean plate is the highest compliment. But from Sadie, it felt like something else. It felt like a challenge accepted. It was a silent message sent back through the swinging doors, a confirmation that the game was on. The rest of the service blurred into a routine I performed on autopilot. I expedited orders, wiped rims, and called times, but my mind remained anchored to table 4. Slowly, the rhythm of the night wound down. The last ticket was stabbed onto the spike. The final dessert went out. Guests began to filter out into the cool night air, wrapping scarves around their necks, leaving empty tables and crumpled napkins in their wake. The dining room lights were dimmed, shifting from the warm glow of service to the moody shadows of closing time. The music was cut. But she didn't move. Sadie Ortega sat alone in the emptying room, her back straight, waiting. The screen of my phone went dark, returning the room to its metallic gloom, but the words burned behind my eyelids. What happens when the tasting menu ends? It was a provocation, a challenge. The kitchen behind me was scrubbed raw, the stainless steel gleaming with a sterile, unforgiving brightness that felt miles away from the warmth of the dining room. I could hear the hum of the compressor in the walk-in, a mechanical heartbeat that usually soothed me, but tonight it just sounded like a countdown. I untied my apron, then stopped. No. I retied it, tighter. It was my armor. If I was going out there to face the woman who held my future in her manicured hands, I wasn't going to do it defenseless. I pushed through the swinging doors. The transition was jarring. The kitchen was a laboratory, cold, bright, loud, but the dining room was a sanctuary. The air here was different. It held the heavy, sweet scent of beeswax candles that had just been extinguished, the wicks still smoking in the dark. It smelled of lingering red wine, expensive perfume, and the faint, dusty warmth of the velvet banquettes. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony of service that still rang in my ears. And there she was. Sadie Ortega sat exactly where she had been 3 hours ago. The other tables were stripped and reset for lunch, ghostly white islands in the gloom, but table 4 was an oasis of clutter. A half-empty bottle of Nebbiolo caught the low light from the street lamps outside. She didn't look up when I entered. She was tracing the rim of her glass with a fingertip, a slow, hypnotic circle that drew my eyes and held them. I walked toward her. My boots, usually silent on the kitchen mats, sounded loud and intrusive on the reclaimed oak floorboards. Each step felt like a confession. I stopped at the edge of her table, the wood separating us like a barrier reef. "You're still here," I said. It wasn't a question. Sadie finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, unreadable pools that reflected the shadows of the room. "The tartare was brilliant," she said, her voice low, a soft rasp that shivered down my spine. "It was dangerous. It had teeth." She paused, and the air between us tightened. "But the duck?" The duck was an apology. I stiffened. "The duck is a classic preparation. It pays homage to a ghost," she cut in, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "It was technically flawless and emotionally dead. You started a conversation with the appetizer and then refused to finish it. Why?" "Because I have a mortgage," I shot back, the frustration boiling over. "Because this building is leveraged to the hilt, and Julian left me with more debt than legacy. I can't afford to scream on every plate, Sadie. Sometimes I just need to whisper so the bank doesn't foreclose." "Then let them foreclose." The words hung in the air, shocking in their callousness. I gripped the back of the empty chair opposite her. "Easy for you to say. You don't have to make payroll." "I don't care about your payroll. I care about your voice." She stood up then, the movement fluid and sudden. The space between us evaporated. She was taller than she looked sitting down, or maybe it was just the authority she radiated. She stepped around the table, encroaching on my personal space, ignoring the professional boundary I had tried to maintain. "I tasted fear in that sauce," she whispered, leaning in until I could smell the wine on her breath, rich, dark. "You're cooking for safety, but that tartare? That was you. I want to know the chef who made that, not the one trying to save a sinking ship." My heart hammered against my ribs. She was stripping me bare, peeling back the layers of excuse and obligation to find the raw nerve underneath. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. "There is no safety in this industry," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Only survival." "Survival is boring," she countered, her gaze dropping to my lips before snapping back to my eyes. "I want to see the reality. I want to see the scars." She gestured toward the swinging doors, the portal back to my world. "Show me where the magic happened. Show me the heat." I looked at the doors, then back at her. The professional world, the reviews, the stars, the debt, seemed to dissolve, leaving only the pull of her gravity. "Come with me," I said. The heavy rubber doors swung inward, and the illusion of the dining room shattered. We stepped out of the velvet hush and into the glare of the clinical. The kitchen lights were unforgiving, fluorescent strips that hummed with a low electric anxiety, reflecting off acres of scrubbed stainless steel. It was a stark, industrial cathedral, smelling of degreaser, reduced veal stock, and the metallic tang of cooling ovens. I watched Sadie absorb the shock of it. In the dining room, she was a queen in her court. Back here, she was an intruder in the engine room. Her heels clicked sharply on the red quarry tile floor, a staccato rhythm that sounded dangerously out of place. She didn't flinch, though. She looked around with that same terrifying curiosity, her eyes scanning the hanging pots, the magnetic knife strips, the neatly stacked deli containers labeled with blue tape. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said, her voice swallowed by the hum of the ventilation. "Efficiency," I replied, leaning back against the prep table, crossing my arms to hide the sudden tremor in my hands. "Steps cost seconds. Seconds cost stars." Sadie walked toward the pass, the long, heated shelf where the transition from raw to cooked from chaos to art, took place. She reached out, trailing a manicured finger along the stainless steel edge. It was an intimate gesture, possessive almost. She was touching the altar. "This is where you stood tonight," she murmured, not looking at me. She touched the heat lamps, which were still radiating a faint, dying warmth. "I could feel you watching me from here. It wasn't just the food on the plate. It was the intent." She turned, her hip resting against the metal counter, and the space between us felt suddenly violently charged. She was too clean for this room. Her silk blouse, the sharp cut of her blazer, it all contrasted beautifully, painfully, with the scarred cutting boards and the carbon-stained ranges behind her. "I have something to show you," she said, her eyes dropping to my forearm. I followed her gaze to the burn scar that ran like a jagged map from my wrist to my elbow. A souvenir from a pan of hot oil and a clumsy stagiaire 3 years ago. "Not that," she said softly. She took a step closer, invading the invisible boundary of my station. "The one from Paris, the internal one." My breath hitched. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me, chef. It's boring." She reached out, her hand hovering over a resting tray of thyme and rosemary, bruising the leaves slightly to release their oils. The scent hit me, earthy, piney, sharp. "I was there," she confessed, 5 years ago. Le Comptoir. The night you tried to serve that impossible soufflé. The air left the room. I stared at her, the memory of that night rushing back. The humiliation, the weeping soufflé, the silence of the dining room. You reviewed that night?" "I didn't review it. I witnessed it." Sadie took another step. She was close now, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Sandalwood and something floral, darker than the herbs. "I watched a talented chef try to be someone else. I watched you fail because you were trying to please a ghost instead of trusting your own palate." She picked up a sprig of rosemary, twirling it between her fingers. "When I wrote that review last year, the one that made you cry, I assume?" "I didn't cry," I lied. I threw a stock pot across the room. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. That's passion. I wrote it because I knew what you were capable of. I needed to break the shell to get to the yolk." She leaned in, bringing the rosemary up, not to her face, but to mine. She brushed the herb against my cheek, a feather-light touch that sent a shockwave through my nervous system. "I was harsh because I needed you to stop being polite. Tonight, with that venison, you weren't polite. You were arrogant. You were brilliant." The kitchen felt suddenly suffocating. The residual heat from the ovens, usually a comfort, pressed in on me. The fluorescent lights felt too bright, exposing everything. My fear, my ambition, my sudden, overwhelming desire to close the remaining inches between us. "You have a strange way of showing support," I managed to whisper, my voice rough. "I'm a critic," Sadie replied, her eyes dropping to my mouth, unflinching. "I don't support. I demand." The heat was unbearable now. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of herbs and the friction of our proximity. I needed air. I needed cold. "It's too hot in here," I said, the words tumbling out. "I need to check the walk-in." Sadie didn't step back. Instead, she tilted her head, a challenge in the arch of her brow. "Lead the way." The heavy door sucked open with a pneumatic hiss, breaking the seal. We stepped inside, and the world instantly tilted on its axis. The aggressive, humid heat of the kitchen was severed, replaced by a wall of biting, sterile cold. I let the heavy silver door slam shut behind us, the latch engaging with a solid, metallic thunk that sealed us inside the insulated box. The silence here was profound. It wasn't empty. It was thick, pressurized, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical chug of the compressor fan mounted above our heads. I watched Sadie react. The shock of 38 degrees hit her instantly. Her shoulders rose, a reflexive defense against the sudden thermal drop. In the dining room, she was armored in confidence and distance. Here, in her silk blouse and tailored blazer, she was exposed. The cold didn't care about her Michelin stars, her biting columns, or her reputation. It just bit. "It's intense," she breathed. A cloud of white mist escaped her lips, lingering for a second in the still air before dissipating. It was the visual proof of her life, her internal heat, suspended right there in the air between us. "It has to be," I said, my voice sounding flat. deadened by the thick insulation panels that line the walls. Cold preserves. Heat destroys. I moved deeper into the narrow aisle, the metal shelving units rising like skyscrapers on either side of us. This was my sanctuary, the only place in the restaurant where time truly stopped. It smelled of raw potential. The damp, loamy scent of unwashed potatoes in burlap sacks, the sharp, citric punch of lemons, the iron tang of the hanging ducks curing in the corner. Sadie followed, her arms wrapping tightly around herself, her hands rubbing her upper arms to generate friction. The space was tight, designed for storage efficiency, not social calls. To pass a crate of winter radishes, she had to turn sideways, her body brushing against the cold metal of the rack. She stopped in front of the hanging meats, the cured pork belly and the aging ribeyes, dark and crusty against the silver walls. "No hiding here," she whispered, reaching out to hover her hand near the dry-aged beef. "No sauces, no plating, just the truth." "That's why I like it," I admitted. "It's honest." I was watching her shiver, fine tremors running through her frame. The compressor kicked into high gear, the fan blasting a fresh wave of frigid air directly at her. She flinched, turning her face away from the artificial wind. Without thinking, I stepped in. I moved between her and the fan, using my body as a shield. The maneuver forced us into an intimacy that the kitchen floor hadn't dared to permit. My back was to the cold, taking the brunt of the draft, while she stood in the pocket of relative warmth created by my chest. The aisle was so narrow that the toes of her boots bumped against mine. She looked up, startled by the sudden proximity. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the dim light. The shivering didn't stop, but it changed rhythm. It wasn't just the cold anymore. "Better?" I asked, my voice dropping to a murmur in the deadened acoustic space. "Warmer," she conceded. She didn't back away. There was nowhere to go. Behind her was a wall of cardboard boxes. Behind me was the fan. We were trapped in a vertical coffin of food and desire. She looked at me, really looked at me, dissecting my face the way she had the tartare. "You come in here to hide," she stated, "when the service gets too loud, when the panic sets in." "I come in here to think," I corrected, though she was right. "The noise, sometimes it drowns out the instincts." "And what is your instinct telling you now?" The question hung in the frosty air. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, loud enough, I feared, for her to hear in the quiet. My instinct was telling me to lean in, to close the 3 inches of space that remained. Instead of answering, Sadie reached up. A bundle of fresh thyme was hanging from the shelf right beside my head, drying in the cold air. Her hand moved past my ear, close enough that I felt the radiant heat of her wrist against my jaw. She crushed a few leaves between her fingers, the scent exploding in the small space. Medicinal, woody, sharp. She brought her fingers back, not to her nose, but to the space between us. "Smell that," she commanded softly. I inhaled. The thyme mixed with her perfume, a dizzying cocktail of earth and elegance. "It's good," I choked out. "It's wild," she corrected. Her gaze dropped to my lips again, lingering there with a weight that felt physical. "It's messy. It's not polite." Her hand was still raised, suspended between us. She was so close I could see the tiny, pale goosebumps rising on the skin of her neck. "Stop trying to polish everything, chef. The best things are a little bit raw." The cold was seeping through my apron now, biting into my back, but the heat radiating from her was a furnace. I wanted to stay in this freezer forever. I wanted to freeze this moment, preserve it like the hanging meat, keep it safe from the morning. But she shivered again, a violent tremor that shook her whole frame. The spell cracked. I couldn't keep her here. It wasn't safe. "You're freezing," I said, the regret tasting bitter on my tongue. "We need to go." "I suppose," she whispered, though she didn't move immediately. She held my gaze for 1 second longer, a silent challenge, before stepping back. I turned and pushed the heavy safety latch. The door cracked open and the warm air rushed in. The warmth of the kitchen washed over us, a sudden, humid embrace after the crisp purgatory of the cold room. My skin prickled with the temperature change, the sensory shock waking up nerve endings I had tried to numb for years. I didn't let the moment settle. I needed a prop, something to bridge the gap between the employee I was supposed to be and the woman I was becoming in her presence. I walked to the high shelf above the pastry station, reaching behind the stacks of vanilla beans to find the bottle I had hidden there. It was a 2004 Barbaresco, a bottle Julian had saved for a milestone that never came. Dust coated the glass like a second skin. I wiped it away with the hem of my apron, the friction warming the dark liquid inside. I didn't bother with the polished crystal from the front of house. I grabbed a single tasting glass from the rack. Just one. The decision was instinctual, a subconscious bid for intimacy that my logical brain hadn't yet authorized. I hopped up onto the stainless steel prep table, my legs dangling over the edge. It was a violation of every rule Julian had drilled into me. Never sit on the pass, never disrespect the station. But tonight, the rules felt like suggestions. Sadie watched me, her head tilted, analyzing the breach of protocol. Then, with a grace that made the industrial setting look like a throne room, she joined me. The metal groaned slightly under our shifting weight, a sound that felt conspiring in the quiet kitchen. I worked the corkscrew, the pop echoing like a gunshot in the silence. I poured. The wine was the color of dried blood, heavy and opaque. I handed the glass to her. She didn't drink immediately. She swirled the liquid, watching the legs run down the crystal, her expression softening from critic to civilian. "You were saving this," she observed, her voice losing its professional edge. "For the day I paid off the loan," I admitted, staring at my boots swinging above the floor drains. "But the interest rates are faster than I am. The bank called again yesterday. They don't care about Michelin stars, Sadie. They care about liquidity. This building, it's an anchor, and I'm tied to it." Sadie took a sip, her eyes closing briefly. When she lowered the glass, a crescent of dark red lipstick stained the rim. She handed it to me. It was a dare. A question. I took the glass, feeling the residual warmth of her fingers on the stem. I didn't rotate it to a clean spot. I placed my lips exactly where hers had been, overlaying her mark with my own. The taste was complex. Tar, cherries, leather, but the texture was all her. It felt like a kiss, mediated by glass and vintage grapes, a stolen intimacy that sent a flush of heat straight to my stomach. "I'm starving," she said suddenly, watching my throat as I swallowed. "I can fire up the grill," I offered, though I knew that wasn't what she meant. "No." She leaned back, bracing her hands on the cold steel behind her, exposing the line of her throat. "I eat for a living, chef. I consume calories. I dissect flavor profiles. But I haven't been fed in years. Do you understand the difference? My life is a performance of taste, but it's entirely hollow. I sit at the best tables in the city, surrounded by people terrified of my notebook, and I have never felt more isolated. I am a ghost at the banquet, observing the feast, but never truly partaking in the joy of it." Her vulnerability was a physical thing, sharper than the knives on the magnetic strip. "I cook for people I never see," I countered, the wine loosening the knot in my chest. "I pour everything I have onto a plate, send it out the door, and wait for judgment. We're both starving, Sadie. We're just on opposite sides of the swinging door." I handed the glass back. Our fingers brushed, a static shock that had nothing to do with the carpet. She took it, her gaze locking onto mine, stripping away the chef's whites, the debt, the fear. "Hunger is useful," she whispered, the glass hovering near her mouth. "It keeps you sharp. It made you reckless tonight. It made you dangerous." "Is that what you want?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Danger?" "I want to feel something," she confessed. "Anything other than the analysis." She set the glass down on the metal counter between us. The sharp clink of crystal on steel echoed too loudly in the quiet kitchen, shattering the fragile atmosphere we had built and signaling that the talking was over. The sound of the glass hitting the steel was a period at the end of a sentence I wasn't ready to finish. It echoed in the cavernous space, sharp and final, shattering the fragile, confessional atmosphere we had built over the wine. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavy, pressurized, and suddenly terrifying. I couldn't just sit there, legs dangling like a teenager, while the most formidable woman in the culinary world dissected my soul. I needed armor. I needed a task. I slid off the counter, my boots hitting the quarry tile with a heavy thud that felt like a retreat. I turned my back to her, grabbing a clean side towel from the stack. It was a reflex, a nervous tic born of 1,000 nights where keeping my hands moving was the only way to keep the panic at bay. I scanned the stainless steel prep table. It was spotless, scrubbed to a mirror finish hours ago by the closing crew. But my mind projected a phantom spill, a smudge, a flaw that needed immediate correction. I need to wipe this down, I stammered, the lye tasting like ash in my mouth. The sugar from the wine, it gets sticky if you leave it. I started to scrub. I leaned into the motion, putting my weight behind the towel, focusing entirely on the friction of cotton against steel. Back and forth, circular motions. The repetitive action was a sedative. If I was cleaning, I was the chef. If I was the chef, she was the critic. If we were chef and critic, there were rules. There were walls. We were safe in our separate boxes. Stop. The word was soft, but it carried the absolute authority of a head chef calling an order. Before I could process the command, her hand shot out. She didn't grab the towel. She grabbed me. Her fingers wrapped around my right wrist, intercepting the motion of the scrub. The contact was a shock to the system, violent in its suddenness. Her skin was cool, conditioned by the air-conditioned dining room and the chill of the wine glass she had been holding. My skin was burning, radiating the heat of the service, the adrenaline of the review, the flush of the wine, and the proximity of her body. The temperature difference was jarring, a physical manifestation of the worlds we occupied. The cool, detached observer and the heated, frantic creator. I froze. The towel hung limp in my hand, forgotten. I stared down at her hand encircling my wrist. Her nails were painted a deep oxblood red, perfect ovals against the scarred, burn-marked landscape of my forearm. It was a study in contrasts, the pristine and the damaged, the judge and the judged. She didn't let go. Instead, she slid her thumb down, finding the radial artery with the same precision she used to find the flaw in a sauce. She pressed lightly. She must have felt it, the erratic, panicked staccato of my heart trying to beat its way out of my veins against the pad of her thumb. She didn't pull away. She held the pulse, measuring it, analyzing the data of my body just as she had analyzed the data of my menu. "Look at me," she said. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I would find. Sadie was still sitting on the counter, which put her face level with mine. Her expression was gone. The professional mask, the wry amusement, the critical distance, it had all evaporated. What was left was raw and terrifyingly open. Her eyes were dark, the pupils dilated so wide they swallowed the iris, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. It was the unflinching gaze of a predator, or perhaps a lover, who had finally decided to stop playing with their food. "You review things, Sadie," I whispered, my voice trembling, a weak attempt to rebuild the wall she had just demolished. "You observe, you critique, you write notes in a little leather book. You don't touch the exhibits." It was a desperate defense, a paper shield raised against a flamethrower. I tried to pull my wrist back, just a fraction of an inch, testing the waters. Her grip tightened instantly. Not painful, but possessive. An anchor. "I'm done working for the night," she said. The sentence was simple, but the implication caused the floor to drop out from under me. The notebook was closed. The pen was capped. The stars, the reputation, the legacy, none of it mattered in the vacuum of this moment. She slid off the counter, her feet finding the floor, her body moving into the space I had been trying to defend. She didn't release my wrist. Instead, she used it as a guide wire to pull herself closer. The air in the kitchen shifted. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to vanish. The smell of the sanitizer and floor wax faded into the background, replaced entirely by the scent of her. Sandalwood, skin, and intent. The space between us collapsed. The professional world, the hierarchy of the kitchen, the power dynamic of the review, ceased to exist. There was no counter between us now. No menu, no bill, just the terrifying magnetic pull of two bodies that had been orbiting each other in the dark for years, finally crashing into the same atmosphere. Her mouth met mine with the same terrifying precision she applied to her writing. It wasn't a tentative exploration or a polite request for entry. It was a verdict. The kiss was a reduction, intense, concentrated, stripping away everything irrelevant until only the essential flavor remained. I tasted the lingering tannins of the Barbaresco, the faint, waxy sweetness of her lipstick, and beneath it all, the sharp, electric shock of Sadie herself. For a heartbeat, my brain tried to hold on to the precipice we were falling over. Conflict of interest. The phrase flashed like a warning light on a failing oven. She was the judge, the arbiter of my career, the woman who could close my doors with a single paragraph. I was the chef, the subject, the one who was supposed to be serving, not taking. But then her hand tangled in the hair at the nape of my neck, her fingers cool and demanding, and the warning light shattered. The logic of the daylight world didn't apply in the blue-black quiet of 2 a.m. There was no board of ethics here, no Michelin guide, no bank loan. There was only the heat rising in the room and the undeniable fact that the most feared woman in the city was currently unraveling me. I stumbled back, my boots scuffing on the quarry tile, until the edge of the stainless steel prep table dug into my lower back. It was a grounding pain, a sharp reminder of where we were. This was my station. This was where I chopped, prepped, and sweated for 14 hours a day. Now, it was the only thing keeping me upright. Sadie followed me, pressing into the space I yielded, her body a soft, heavy weight against the rigid front of my chef's coat. My hands, usually so sure with a knife or a plating tweezer, hesitated. They hovered at her waist, uncertain of the terrain. I was used to handling searing hot pans, rough root vegetables, and wet, slick proteins. I wasn't used to this, the terrifying fragility of silk, the warmth of a rib cage expanding with breath beneath a tailored blazer. "Touch me," she murmured against my mouth, a command that vibrated through my jaw. "Stop thinking about the review and touch me." I obeyed. I let my hands settle on the curve of her waist, the fabric of her blouse slippery and cool against my calloused palms. I pulled her closer, eliminating the last fraction of air between us. The sensation was overwhelming. It was a sensory overload that rivaled the busiest Saturday night service. The scent of her sandalwood perfume mixing with the industrial smell of floor wax and old garlic, the sound of our ragged breathing echoing off the tile, the taste of her sigh as I deepened the kiss. She tasted of consequence. I knew with a sudden crystal clarity that I could never undo this. Tomorrow, she would be Sadie Ortega, the critic, and I would be the chef with the debt. But the line had been crossed. The ink on the review was already dry. Or maybe it wasn't written yet. But whatever words she chose would now be filtered through the memory of this. The way her body arched when my hand slid up her spine. The way her grip on my shoulder tightened, anchoring us both in the storm. We weren't just two people hooking up in a closed restaurant. We were two lonely, starving professionals finally breaking the fast. The hunger she had spoken of earlier wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a physical ache, a desperate need to consume and be consumed. I kissed her like I cooked, with obsession, with a need to perfect the moment, to explore every texture and nuance. I traced the line of her jaw with my thumb, feeling the pulse hammering there, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. The kitchen, usually a place of controlled chaos and rigid hierarchy, dissolved around us. The prep table, the heat lamps, the hanging tickets, they became irrelevant scenery. The only reality was the friction of her blazer against my apron, the coolness of her fingers slipping beneath my collar to touch the hot skin of my neck, and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that the tasting menu had definitely ended, and we were now in uncharted territory. We pulled apart only when the first gray light of dawn touched the high windows. The transition from the blue-black intimacy of the night to the harsh gray reality of morning was violent. The first shaft of dawn light hit the stainless steel pass, turning our romantic shadows into unforgiving metal and exposing everything. The smudge of her lipstick on the wine glass, the wrinkles in my apron, the disarray of my hair. Sadie moved first. She stepped back from the prep table, smoothing her silk blouse with a quick, efficient motion that signaled the return of the professional. She reached for her blazer, sliding her arms into the sleeves, and with that simple action, she rebuilt the walls we had spent hours dismantling. She didn't look at me immediately. She pulled a compact from her purse, checking her reflection in the small mirror. The vulnerability I had tasted was gone, replaced by the polished veneer of Sadie Ortega, the woman who could make or break a career with a single adjective. I watched her, feeling a phantom ache in my chest where her weight had been just moments ago. There were no sweet nothings, no promises of next time. We both knew the rules. She had a deadline to meet, and I had a prep list that started in 3 hours.
"The review runs on Tuesday," she said, snapping the compact shut.
Her voice was steady, but there was a roughness to it, a remnant of the night that she hadn't quite smoothed over. "I know," I replied, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet. She walked to the back door, the heavy steel exit that led to the alleyway. It was the exit for trash and deliveries, not for Michelin reviewers. But she didn't hesitate. Her hand hovered over the push bar. She paused, looking back at me one last time. The morning light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. She didn't smile, but her eyes were soft, stripped of their usual critical distance. "Clean your station, chef," she whispered. Then the door opened, admitting a blast of cold morning air and the sound of early traffic, and she was gone. The latch clicked shut, sealing the kitchen once more. I stood there for a long time. The scent of her sandalwood perfume still hung faintly in the air, fighting a losing battle against the smell of stale fryer oil and floor cleaner. I walked back to the prep table and picked up the wine glass, running my thumb over the lipstick stain one last time before carrying it to the dish pit. I washed it myself, watching the red mark dissolve under the hot water, erasing the evidence, but not the memory. I began the opening ritual. I turned on the gas range, the pilot lights catching with a soft whoosh that usually sounded like a threat, but today sounded like a promise. I pulled my knife from its roll, the steel feeling cool and familiar in my hand. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was an extension of the hand that had touched her. The delivery truck knocked on the bay door 10 minutes later. I signed the invoice for the produce, checking the crates of chanterelles with a focus that felt sharper, cleaner. The terror that usually gripped me at the start of a day, the fear of the bank, the fear of failure, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, burning ember of certainty. My phone buzzed against the metal table, vibrating in the exact spot where hers had been hours ago. My heart jumped. I wiped my hands and picked it up. It wasn't a draft of the review. "The coffee at this bakery is tragic. It lacks your precision." I stared at the screen, a smile cracking my exhaustion. It was a mundane complaint, a tiny window into her morning, but it felt heavier than a star. The review would come, and it would say what it said, but as I looked around my kitchen, I realized the verdict didn't frighten me anymore. I had fed the hunger of the one person who mattered. The next night, I stood at the pass, plating the venison tartare. I placed the wood sorrel with the same obsession, but my hand was steadier. I knew she wasn't at table 4, but she was there, in the back of my mind. I finally hit send on my reply, then come back for the espresso. If you've ever risked everything for a moment that felt like a lifetime, subscribe for more stories from the kitchen. The kitchen printer whirred to life. One new order.